Well, it's a great honor and a privilege to be in front of you this evening for our 27th presidential lecture series, and the first one to be live streaming. So, you know, we hope somebody's out there. But more importantly, you are here, and our special guest, Giff Johnson, is here. Giff is really kind of well known for a couple of things. This is one, and this is the other. There are a couple of other books in between. But he's well known for being the husband of Darlene Keju, a nuclear activist from the Marshall Islands whose voice was amplified in the work about Darlene's life entitled Don't Ever Whisper, very stirring account. Now, nobody knows what goes on between two people who have made a lifetime commitment to each other. And I'm not going to attempt to go there, other than to say whatever happened between Giff and Darlene made it possible for hundreds of Marshallese and thousands of Pacific Islanders to not just speak out, but to find their voice, to see that in an uncaring world, you can make people really care. And in a hostile world, you can make people understand, and in an ignorant world, you can teach people real knowledge. Darlene did those things, and she increased the magnitude of her abilities and her mission in life by her relationship with Giff. They met in 1978 in a presentation on Micronesian issues where Giff was an activist who was trying to present a point of view for the Micronesian Support Committee. I don't know what it's like to be known by your spouse. Well, I'm starting to learn right now. Male attitudes and testosterone sometimes get in the way of that, but Giff himself is a testimony to being a great facilitator. But Giff is more than that. He's a committed man, a man of courage and a man of conviction. He facilitated the important voice that Darlene provided, and he devoted his skills to writing a couple of other works. Collision Course at Kwajalein, Marshall Islands in the Shadow of the Bomb in 1984, and Nuclear Pass, Unclear Future in 2009, in addition to the biography. Secondly, Giff is known as being editor of the Marshall Islands Journal and an incisive writer and critic of life in the Marshall Islands while living in the Marshall Islands. You may not know what kind of social and cultural skills that takes, but you should. The fact that he is able to survive and thrive in a small Pacific Island environment while daring to tell inconvenient truths and pointing out dispiriting facts is an accomplishment on its own, and he's been doing this for 30 years. He's in the journalism business, so we know two things from being in the journalism business. One, he doesn't care about money. And secondly, he cares about people. The only business that comes close to that is being a teacher or maybe a social worker. But journalists are required to seek out the truth of an issue and then make judgments about what to reveal and when, and to determine the narrative in which facts are brought out so that society is advanced and improved. That's a pretty tall order. And Giff again moved all of us in that direction in his newest work, Idyllic No More, Pacific Island Climate, Corruption, and Development Dilemmas. This work should become standard for anyone who wants to call themselves an island expert, maybe even for anyone who wants to call themselves an islander. His use of the term dilemma is interesting. Dilemma is defined as a problem offering two possibilities, neither of which is unambiguously acceptable or even preferable. The more popular way of looking at it is you're between a rock and a hard place. In the Godfather movies, we were given an offer that you can't refuse. And here he is, a fan of hard rocks and hard places and low-lying islands. Giff Johnson.
Thank you, Dr. Underwood, for a wonderful introduction, and I think maybe we should just stop right here and all go home. And I want to explain that what Dr. Underwood says about living in a small island is quite true. If you folks haven't been on an atoll, let's start by saying we have one road, and it's pretty hard to get lost. But moreover, when you write about people in the newspaper, you're guaranteed to see the person you wrote about the day the newspaper comes out. You're going to walk into a restaurant and he'll be there or she'll be there. So you learn how to talk to people and how to communicate and survive. But I think there's a trick that I have, and the reason that I do survive actually has nothing to do with my skill at all. And that is that I have now, Robert told us a little bit about my first wife, Darlene. Well, sadly, she died of cancer some years ago, and I'm happily remarried to a wonderful Marshallese lady by the name of Matiti, and she happens to be the loan manager at the Bank of the Marshall Islands. And as it happens, 95% of people in the Marshall Islands have loans at the Bank of Marshall Islands. So I think that's why I get along just fine with everybody in Marshall Islands. So I'm very thankful to that fact. Well, Dr. Underwood also mentioned about how I met my first wife, and maybe this is why I always enjoy giving a talk to students and people interested in Micronesia, Marshall Islands, Pacific issues, because almost 40 years ago, I was in Honolulu doing a slideshow about nuclear testing, and when I was putting away my slideshow, this was way before PowerPoints were conceived, putting away my slides, this young woman from the Marshall Islands walked up to me, stuck her hand out, and said, "Hi, I'm Darlene Keju from the Marshall Islands." And, well, let's just say that 4 years later, we got married. And that, it's probably a really good thing that happened, or I doubt I'd be here talking to you tonight. But more to the point is that I got a great result from giving that talk. Now, not every talk results in that kind of an outcome, but we hope for the best, and I always enjoy seeing a group like this, and thank you all so much for coming and joining us tonight. I'd like to talk a little bit particularly about the freely associated states. You live in Guam, so there's a lot of discussion about migration issues of people from what we call the freely associated states, which is shorthand for people who come from the islands that have treaties called the Compact of Free Association with the United States. And there's three: Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and Marshall Islands. And some of the points I'd like to make apply pretty equally to the Marshalls and the Federated States, or the FSM. Palau has a little bit different profile, maybe some better outcomes because it has more of an economy with tourism, and a lot of things are happening in the economy and in the school system there that aren't as much evident in the eastern part of Micronesia and the Marshall Islands. So, these islands are small, they're underdeveloped, not undeveloped, but they're underdeveloped. But one of the key things I think to keep in mind is that there's actually plenty of money. It isn't like these islands don't have resources. They do. And the real issue in the Marshall Islands and the FSM is more to do with management and how we use the money and the performance. It's not so much we're broke, we don't have money to do something. And coupled with that is there's kind of what I would call, there's clear corruption in many areas of government. And of course, corruption undermines development progress, undermines national development. There's no two ways about it. And institutions that are in charge of enforcing, say, auditor generals, attorney generals, ombudsmen, if there are any, are generally pretty weak. So it allows for corruption to happen, and often we laugh and say, well, sometimes you might say in the Pacific Islands, actually corruption does pay, because at high levels, nothing happens. And I would say that this is a factor, a little bit a factor in outmigration from these countries, not only to Guam, but Hawaii and the mainland US, because of its effect on development progress in the islands. Just a week ago, if you pay attention to Pacific news, you would have seen that in the country, South Pacific country of Vanuatu, they had essentially a landmark decision in their Supreme Court where the judge ruled that 14 of 16 members of parliament, that would be like the Guam legislature, so 14 of 16 members who were charged with bribery and corruption were found guilty, including the deputy prime minister, the speaker of the parliament, a former prime minister, and a bunch of, and the finance minister a few weeks earlier had pled guilty already. So net result was 15 of 16 charged, almost a third of the parliament found guilty by the judge. So the next day, what does the acting president do, who was found guilty by that decision? He pardons himself and everybody. Well, then the actual president, who was away in Samoa on a visit, comes back a couple days. This is just this past week, and he rescinds the pardon, says you can't do that, and now people are being put in jail and being arrested, and justice is kind of proceeding along. But this is a high point in corruption in the Pacific, of course. I mean, 14, 15 members of parliament being found guilty. But over the last year or two, we've read stories about the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea having an arrest warrant put out for him because of corruption issues. In the Marshall Islands, we've seen a lot of people go to trial, go to jail for all kinds of corruption type things to do with manipulating procurement and bidding and basically undermining work of the hospital in order to make some money. And the thing is, it's happening, okay? I mean, here are some very clear examples of it that have been reported, are in the courts. And I mentioned that we have weak institutions that, for enforcement, but also, island culture is very non-confrontational. And especially on small islands, especially on atolls, you have to get along with everybody. I mean, you might really not like your neighbor, but on the surface, you got to shake his hand or her hand and smile and be friendly, which complicates dealing with problems in government or corruption. How do you confront somebody when your status is lower than theirs? And so there's a lot of cultural elements to that. But I'd also like to say that corruption isn't just somebody stealing a lot of money or bribing high-level leaders to get what they want. I mean, corruption kind of comes in a lot of forms, one of which is just don't come to work on time. If you work for government, come to work at 10, leave at 11, and get paid for 80 hours for your 2 weeks, even though you didn't show up to work. And part of this attitude, and this isn't everybody, but as a generalization, there's a lot of this going on. And so you go, well, how did this sort of come about? And my observation is that if you look at donor aid in Micronesia, the former trust territory, and then as the islands became independent, hiring people in government became a way to spread the wealth. You hire people, and that's the way everybody kind of gets their little piece of the pie of this incoming donor aid. So you get a job as the assistant administrator, the secretary, the whatever, and you got a $6,000 or $8,000 or $10,000, $15,000 salary, and that's your little hook into the system. Well, this kind of really a story that a friend of mine told me that happened about 2 years ago, like how this actually plays out in day-to-day stuff. So a person got moved to a new office, and the person was told, look, we have a problem. People don't come to work on time. People punch in for other people. And you're like, can you take this and straighten it out? Like, work it out with the workers. It's not the way it should be. So this person gets with the workers and starts talking with them, trying to build some rapport, and says, look, you got to come to work, at least come to work. And then, you can get your 80 hours and get your paycheck. After 2 weeks, there was a petition that went to the government's hiring agency to get rid of the supervisor because she wanted them to come to work on time. And you go, really? Well, that's like, you know, you tell stories like this about the Pacific, people would say, no, 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 you got to be making it up. But it's true. And it's like, it's just ingrained how people got hired. And so, I mean, is it surprising that we have kind of poor education results, or we can't solve problems in health? And like lately, now with so many donors active in the Pacific, half of our government workforce is traveling all the time. And there was a health conference in Australia earlier this year, and one of the Australians or New Zealanders, he got up and said, you know, we got doctors and nurses who are traveling up to 6 months of the year. They're just not home to deliver health services. I mean, it's really disrupting programs. And, you know, you look at public education, like we just had the results come out from the national testing of elementary students in the Marshall Islands. And, you know, it's just very disappointing. I mean, there's just very little improvement year to year. You know, we see things like 1 in 4 students at 3rd or 6th grade level, 1 out of 4 is proficient in English or in math. Well, that means 3 out of 4 are not. You know, they're not at grade level. And it just goes on year after year. And then in health, we've got this diabetes and non-communicable disease epidemic. I mean, I'm sure it's a big problem on Guam. It's a global phenomenon now of developed societies, but it's particularly a problem in places like the Marshall Islands and the FSM. And, you know, when you think about like development, you know, there's only so many government workers you can hire. I mean, at some point, you just can't hire more workers into the government. And that's pretty much like they're saturated. And there's not much going on in the private sector. I mean, we have private sectors, but it's like government has all this money from donors, but then the FSM has had over $100 million in construction money. Bottleneck, just can't get it out, can't manage it and get it out for projects. And what that means is people aren't getting jobs. They're not getting hired. The roads or the hospital or the schools aren't getting built. And same thing has been happening in Marshall Islands. And so you don't have jobs available. The schools aren't doing really well. You can't get certain types of medical treatment you need. So what do? And I think this is part of the push of outmigration. And, you know, several years ago, before the Hawaii homeless situation really got out of control, and I don't know if you folks took a look at the Guam Daily Post today, there's an article about Hawaii where the governor has declared an emergency to do with homelessness in order to free up more money to try to do some things to help. But there's a significant number of Micronesians and Marshallese in the homeless encampment that's been being cleared out in Kaka'ako recently. But before this really built up into a big homeless camp, one of our reporters was up in Honolulu, and she went down and interviewed a few Marshall Islanders who are homeless in Hawaii. Like, just talk to them, like, why are you homeless in Hawaii? You know, every Marshall Islander has land. Everybody from Micronesia, you have land. You have more than a piece of land. You have land all over the place. You know, why wouldn't you be in your own place? So anyway, she talked to this woman who is maybe 40 years old, 3 children, married, and they're out in the park during the day, the mother is, and lives in a shelter at night. And we said, well, wouldn't you be better off to be home in Madro? Like, you're homeless. Why are you staying here? And she says, oh, no, you don't understand. She says, I'm much better off here. Says, I stay in the shelter with my kids at night. They're enrolled in the public elementary school. They're getting a good education. They were like 2nd, 4th, 5th grade. They're getting a good education, and I know that they'll have a better future because of that. So I sit out in the park during the day, and in time, our life will be better. Now, that's a striking comment about life in Marshall Islands today, I would say, from just an ordinary Marshallese. So the Compact of Free Association, which is the treaty between the U.S. and these 3 Micronesian governments, really is a safety valve provides a safety valve for the island so people can get out for education and jobs and health care and so on. But it provides this visa-free access in exchange for defense benefits to the United States. Very significant military value of this area to the United States. Now, climate issues are coming more and more into the picture now, but I don't really think climate has been a factor in migration of people coming to Guam or Hawaii or the U.S. mainland. I mean, we've been reading about, there's been a guy in Kiribati living in New Zealand who claims to be the world's first climate refugee, and he was trying to get visa approval to stay in New Zealand so he wouldn't be returned home to Kiribati. But really, I haven't heard people in the Marshall saying, I'm leaving because of climate problems. But I think it will become an issue as storms are worsening, like this current El Nino we're in is going to produce apparently a major drought much of next year, and that'll create some serious hardships because we don't have any sources of water other than rain. So if you don't get rain for 9 months, it's a little tricky. But the Marshalls, FSM, Palau President, people in the Marshalls, Kiribati, a lot of other government leaders, they're really pushing the climate issue internationally, trying to get the big countries to come to the table, particularly because in December there's a big global meeting in Paris to try to come up with an agreement to reduce greenhouse gas and slow down the warming of the planet. Well, this is great. And there's been a lot of money pledged by donors to help out the small islands, help out countries that are, that are vulnerable and so on. But actually, there's really very little on the ground that we've seen. And maybe I'm being too cynical, but I said, well, if attendance at climate workshops and conferences was what it was all about, then we've already won the battle. Because we've got so many hundreds of people, and I mean, every government agency is going to these meetings, but we really haven't made the connection between that promotion of this is a problem, climate change, sea level rise, we need to do something. Well, what's the something, and to get that on the table and do it. So my thinking is, looking at the migration picture for people in Marshall Islands and Micronesia, it's going to continue much the same as it has been happening. Very likely could pick up in coming years. Guam and Hawaii in particular, just because you and Hawaii are the first stop on the plane, are going to see more people coming in. But it's really interesting. Father Fran Hiesel, who is a Jesuit priest who's now in Guam, he did a study for the FSM government just 3 or 4 years ago about Micronesians living in the U.S. and Hawaii and Guam. And his information shows that Micronesians living in the U.S. mainland are doing much better economically, just all around than generally than in Hawaii or in Guam. And I think this reflects things like, well, with the Marshall Islanders, there's this huge community in Northwest Arkansas. Imagine that. Pretty soon we're going to have to create Northwest Arkansas as the 25th local government of the Marshall Islands, because there's like 10,000 Marshall Islanders there. Well, it's because they've got heavy manufacturing. People just walk into a job, everybody's employed. So housing costs are low, so people do okay. I mean, it's not maybe your ideal of cutting chicken on a factory line, but there are now so many Marshall Islanders living in Arkansas that you don't need to speak English to go work, because you walk into a factory and the whole shift is Marshall Islanders. So you can speak Marshallese, doesn't matter you didn't go to high school. You can just march in and get a job and be very comfortable. And that's why I see the balance is starting to shift now. As more and more Micronesians, Marshallese get planted, you get these communities really set up. They've got everything they need. Arkansas, Northwest Arkansas, there's over 27 Marshallese churches in Northwest Arkansas. How about that? 27 Marshallese churches. So it tells you, people have the things that they need. They've got enough family, and they can live and do things that they would do at home. Birthdays, weddings, the kind of cultural events, Christmas time, and they've got the critical mass to make it work. But as I say, the difference is in the U.S. mainland seems to be people are a bit more prosperous, though that's a bit of a generalization. And I would estimate, based on U.S. Census data and other studies that have been done, that now probably as many as 30 to 40% of both Micronesians and Marshall Islanders now live in Guam, Hawaii, or the U.S. mainland. And pretty soon we'll be at the 50% mark, I'd say pretty soon. And one of the things about moving to the U.S. is things tend to work. Generally, yeah, the power goes out in Guam, maybe too often, but things do work. And if you walk into an agency or a school, you can get a result. You can go register your kid at the school. People pretty much handle you as a customer walking in the door. And this isn't always the way it works in the islands, and particularly if you don't have status or you're at maybe a lower strata of the community. And I think this is why another motivator for people to go out is they feel that they have a chance to get ahead in that situation. Well, it's really true that particularly Guam and Hawaii have had significant cost budget issues heavily to do with medical care that relates to people coming from the freely associated states. And part of the problem is, as I mentioned earlier, about the diabetes epidemic. So you get people in late-stage diabetes who cannot get treatment in the islands. There's no dialysis in the islands, and of course dialysis is quite expensive, and so people come outside looking for treatment, because if they don't get it, they'll die. I mean, it's as simple as that. So you've got a lot of people in that situation. Well, the compact is an agreement between the U.S. and the Marshall Islands, FSM, and Palau governments. And frankly, the Congress and the federal government need to step up to the table here and do some more. It's really important to understand that this is not a one-way agreement. This is not like, oh, this is just something we're giving to these folks in Micronesia or Marshall Islands. It isn't like that. I mean, the U.S. government has defense control of this entire area, which is a very significant bit of authority for the United States. It runs the missile testing range at Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands, which is the premier missile testing range that the United States operates. It has a long history with nuclear testing in the island. So there's a big relationship in which the visa-free access to the United States is part of. And that's the flip side of the agreement with the islands. And, here's what I think and what the Guam congressional delegation, the governor, Hawaii congressional delegation has been pushing to try to get the U.S. Congress to turn Medicaid back on for people from the FAS, because it's not really clear to me why, and probably Dr. Underwood could speak to this much better than I can, but in 1996, the Congress cut off Medicaid for people from Micronesia. And frankly, if that was restored, it would just take a huge burden off Guam, Hawaii. I mean, it would just cut the financial thing way down. And why not? I mean, immigrants to the U.S. have access to numerous types of health coverage, so it seems very discriminatory in that way. But there are other things, like, for example, in 2005, the U.S. Congress, following 9/11, passed a law which probably nobody in this room has heard of, but it's called the Real ID Act, and it's to do with identification and how states issue identification, driver's license, state ID. And in that law, nobody mentioned the freely associated states, but they mentioned immigrants and blah, 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 and all the requirements. So if I'm an immigrant with a green card, say, and I go into the vehicle registration place to get my driver's license, and I say, well, I'm from, here, let me get my driver's license. They say, well, where's your green card? And they go through, there's a whole list of requirements. So a Marshallese goes in and says, I want to get my driver's license in, say, Oregon. And they go, well, where's your green card? Well, I don't need a green card. I said, well, where's your visa? I don't need a visa. Yeah, but it doesn't say anything here in the law. So the effect of this is that throughout the United States, Marshallese and Micronesians haven't been able to get regular identification, which makes it hard for them to get jobs or get an apartment. So they say, why doesn't he have a regular license? Maybe he's a convict and they're only giving him a one-year thing or something. They suspended it. So these are the sort of things that have really hurt the relationship for no reason at all. I mean, it's just omissions of people just not being aware of, you know, we used to joke about Micronesia in the U.S., and Dr. Underwood, I'm sure, had this all the time when he was serving in Congress. You go up and start talking to someone about Micronesia, and, you know, Micronesia, this, and the guy goes, looks at you kind of like this, and goes, Mike who? And I mean, that's, you know, in the U.S., that's kind of, unfortunately, the way it's been for a long time. So I think that the U.S. Congress could do some things, but interestingly, Micronesians and Marshallese are not just sitting around like acting hopeless or can't do anything. In Oregon, they've done a really interesting thing. In the last 2 years, the Marshallese and the Micronesian community organizations have connected with U.S. American veterans groups and with various other Americans who are interested, and they've started to lobby the Oregon state legislature. And the first thing they got the legislature to do was to pass an identification act allowing Micronesians and Marshallese to get regular identification done. So Oregon is the first state in the U.S. to take action to get rid of that problem that the U.S. Congress caused. And this has been a great way of engaging the Micronesian community. The Marshallese community has gotten out and talking with the legislators, talking with them, getting them involved, and now they've got a bill pending to get Oregon to fund medical coverage for Micronesians and Marshallese. First state that I'm aware of that's taking this situation and moving forward on its own. Now, of course, it's harder to get that done because it's money and everybody's budget conscious. But my point is, they're engaging, they're talking, people are learning who are these communities, but in a positive way. And I just loved it because several months ago, because of this ongoing back and forth with the legislature, the legislature in Oregon has a policy. Every day they're in session, they invite a different pastor from a different church to say the blessing. So the Micronesian community said, well, could we get in line and get a day when we say the blessing? So sure. So they invited one of the pastors, and they said, well, we'd like to bring a choir because, you know, we always sing a song or two, right? You go to church, Micronesian, Marshallese church, got to sing, right? So they brought the Bikinians, there's like 50 or 100 of them in Oregon. They all came in all dressed up, and they sang the Bikini National, or the Bikini Anthem. And the Bikini Anthem is a song that was written after they were moved by the U.S. Navy in 1946 off their islands for the nuclear testing. So it's I mean, you have to get the translation, which I'm sure was properly provided to the legislators, which explains this song of deep sadness of people being forced to leave their islands. I mean, think about it, and never go back. Anyway, it's a beautiful anthem sung to the Oregon State Legislature. A few days later, they passed a resolution recognizing the Marshallese, Palauans, and Micronesians who were serving in the U.S. Armed Forces. And in the balcony at the Oregon State Legislature, they had all these Micronesians who came down to witness this unanimous 57-0 vote, thanking all the vets from the Pacific Islands. And the legislators gave them a standing ovation to all the Micronesians. So the thing is, like, in Guam and in Hawaii, it's like there's been a bad relationship, or at least it hasn't been positive recently, right? Because of, you know, the migration issues, and everybody say, oh, there's compact impact and we're having problems. Well, I think we need to redefine that relationship, talk more about it, get people more engaged, because Oregon, where there are a lot of Micronesians and Marshallese, probably 8,000 or 10,000 in the area, have just turned the whole thing around and gone in a totally different direction and gotten very energized with their legislators. So I think there's a lot can be done. And there's one really big glaring hole in U.S. policy to the Marshall Islands, and that is the nuclear weapons testing legacy. And, you know, this is the way it worked. And I think people in Guam are interested in this too, because their Guam leaders have made a pitch to the U.S. Congress to get claims recognized here that people in Guam were also exposed to nuclear testing from Bikini and Eniwetok in the Marshall Islands. Well, here's the thing, is, you know, my comment toward the U.S. government, both the Congress and the federal government, is just because the nuclear weapons testing in the Marshall Islands was 60 years ago doesn't mean the problems have disappeared. And the thing is, the Compact of Free Association established a compensation provision, and it provided a trust fund of $150 million to be paid out annually in increments to the acknowledged nuclear affected atolls, and also established a nuclear claims tribunal to adjudicate all nuclear claims in the Marshall Islands. So this tribunal hired judges, lawyers, scientists, doctors, land appraisers, and they spent 15 years and went through a very detailed process in adjudicating claims. And they came up with the awards for people who were relocated, for nuclear cleanups, for medical care, for hardship, and also for personal injury for people who had cancer and so on, of over $2.3 billion. Now, the trust fund was 150, paid out about 300 million, and it's gone. Okay? And the U.S. says, sorry, the agreement, full and final, we're done. Well, contrast that with the United States. In America, there is a group of people known as the downwinders. These are nuclear victims who lived in the area of the Nevada nuclear test site, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico area, and were exposed, just like Marshall Islanders, didn't know anything about it. These Americans were exposed to nuclear testing. So about 25 years ago, the U.S. Congress created a law to compensate the downwinders. They started with $100 million. And good for them, because they deserve compensation. Well, the money ran out. So what did the Congress do? Put more money in. Ran out again, because the claims kept coming in from the downwinders and other nuclear victims. So what did the U.S. Congress do? Put more money up. Now they're up to $2 billion. Why do we have this difference in treatment between the Marshall Islands, which had the nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands was over 90 times more. All the hydrogen bombs were tested out here. Why? Because, of course, the United States couldn't test those big, dirty bombs in the United States. So it used the Marshall Islands because there weren't very many people, and it did it out here. All Marshall Islanders are saying is, be fair. Be fair. You came out and used our islands, solve the legacy. The Nuclear Claims Tribunal says it's worth $2.3 billion. What do you say? And the U.S. government's response has been so bad that a New York state representative by the name of Gary Ackerman, about 5 years ago, confronted a panel of U.S. government officials in a congressional hearing, and he said, he looked at him and he says, well, it seems to me that the policy of our government is we're just waiting for these people to die, right? And I mean, that's basically it. And after, in a few more years, most of the people who were exposed in 1954 and onward will be dead. And it's a really serious, outstanding problem that needs to be addressed. And I think the fact is that that issue is paramount in the relationship with the Marshall Islands, but in terms of issues of outmigration and medical coverage for Micronesians, Marshallese, Palauans living in the U.S., the federal government definitely needs to step up and do more to solve those so that they aren't these huge problems for Guam and states like Hawaii. There's also, I would say there's a lot more that can be done in the islands, particularly to prepare people for going outside. If we had better schools, people would be better prepared to take advantage of the opportunity. I mean, people are leaving because they want a better opportunity. Just like all migrants, people leaving one place and going to another. They're looking for an opportunity. But we've had so many challenges in our public schools, another reason why people are leaving. But I think, there's a lot more that could be done there. And in fact, in recent months, we've seen some non-government groups setting up like migrant resource centers both in Pohnpei, in Majuro, and there's now one in Hawaii, and I think there's going to be one set up here to try to get more engaged with the Micronesian and Marshallese community. But the fact of the matter is, with the exception of Palau, which has pretty much a booming economy because of tourism, which the FSM and the Marshalls just don't have, the fact is the FSM and the Marshalls are going to be dependent on donor aid for a long time to come. Possibly it can be reduced, but I mean, here we are. The first compact started in 1986. It's now almost 2016, almost 30 years later, and this year's budget, national budget for the Marshall Islands, is about 60% donor provided. Well, it was about 60% donor provided 25 years ago. So, we haven't really changed the picture. And the only thing that's really coming up is the fishery, which is now the tuna fishery is beginning to produce very significant money for both the FSM and Marshall Islands. Question is, what gets done with the money? Can we reinvest it so we create some interesting possibilities for local residents? And I think with the weak economies, they just can't support the job needs. And Marshall Islands, the actual number of employees has gone down in the last few years. So jobs are hard to come by. And, I feel like these are the kind of issues that need engagement and discussion, particularly by younger people, students, whether you're Micronesian, Marshallese, Palauan, that's important. If you are, you need to be talking about these, but so too for people here in Guam and in Hawaii and Americans. These are really key issues that need to be talked about, need to be engaged with. This is really why I put this book together, because I felt that, it would help to stimulate some of this talk that needs to be going on. And, and I look at Marshall Islands and I look at the FSM, what I think is one of our shortcomings is that we lack what I would call consumer demand. And that, when I say that, it's like if you're a parent and your kid's in a school and you go to a PTA meeting and the school reports, well, we're really sorry to tell you, but academic achievement in our school has dropped by 20% this year, and the gymnasium is broken, we have to condemn it, and we have no money for this and that. And all this, probably the PTA would be outraged, and people would stand up and be, well, what are you talking about? Get rid of, fire the principal, or what's the answer to this? We have to find a solution. And in the islands, it's sort of like people, the teachers aren't showing up to work. Academic performance is down. And that's that lack of engagement partly because of cultural norms, constraints about talking openly and confronting and, just asking questions out in the open, which is part of Chamorro culture just as much as it is of Marshallese or Micronesian culture, but it limits what we can do, and we need to be talking about this. We need to get more results because there is money. There is a lot of aid money. Now there's a lot of fisheries money. 10 years ago, we had $2 million a year from fisheries in Marshall Islands. This year's budget has $20 million from the tuna fishery, okay? So it's just, that means there's something you can do. You have resources. So we've got to find a way, and I think that's where young folks, particularly people who are studying, who are thinking about what am I going to be doing? What am I going to do in the next 5 or 10 years? There's a big role for all of you folks who are here in an institution like the University of Guam to be debating, talking about these, because frankly, we need energy, ideas. We need to get more of this out on the table and get good performance so that, you know, kids in our schools are getting ahead and have a good opportunity and maybe don't feel like they have to go to the U.S. to get a better education. And so on that note, I would like to say I hope that I haven't put you all to sleep on a Monday evening and that your stomachs aren't grumbling too much about thinking about dinner, and say thank you very much for being a very attentive audience.